Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Modding, Episode 8. Today I'm going to take you through how I do my custom paint. This is going to be a bit more of an advanced video because not everyone has access to compressors and spray guns, and there's a lot to go through to get to this point. What I mean by that is you need to learn about the compressor that you need, the specifications, all of the different spray gun brands, which one is going to be suitable for you, the adjustments of the spray gun, how to spray, how to get a good finish, all of the different paint types and brands. There is definitely a lot to learn, and I learned all of it through trial and error. And so all I'm hoping with this video is that I can take out a few of the real challenges that I experienced and make things a bit easier. So for any modder who has found the limits of spray cans and wants to take things to the next level with custom paint, well, this is certainly the next level, and this is where to start. So let's start with what you are going to need. Well, first of all, you are going to need a compressor. And compressor brands are going to be different all over the world. So I suggest going into an air tools store or hardware, tell them what you are going to be using the compressor for, and they will suggest a number of good options for you. Next up, you are going to need a spray gun. And you could just go into any paint specialty store, but they're just going to give you probably a beginner's gun. I mean, they might have something a little bit nicer, but if you want something really nice, then I suggest doing some research. Find out what the professionals use, what they like. And again, it's going to be different around the world, but after some research, I found that a lot of professionals use and love DeVelbis guns, particularly the GTI Pro, as kind of a bit more of a mid-range gun. It's still high-end, but it's not like some of the extremely expensive guns. It's something you can pick up for a good price, but it is still, a very nice gun. And I can tell you, when I went from my, basically what I call a beginner's gun, very rough, cheap gun, to something like this, and just to give you an idea, the gun I started with was worth about $85, and this one is worth about $600. You definitely notice the difference. I mean, what I can achieve with this gun, particularly the finish, makes me look good. I mean, it's just amazing, and with no effort at all. It makes it so much easier. So I'm extremely happy with this gun. Now, you don't need two guns. I could easily get away with just using this gun. This is a dedicated primer gun. Now, the primer doesn't matter so much, so you can see that this is a cheaper gun, but it has a 2mm nozzle, specifically designed for primer. This one has a 1.3mm nozzle designed for top coat, so base coat and clear coat. But I often just run my primer through this gun anyway, because I like to use my primer quite thin, because what I'm doing, I don't usually need a filler. I'm going into too much detail here already, but anyway. So next up, protective equipment. Obviously, a good mask. This is a 3M mask. You need to make sure the filters on the mask are designed for paint. So they need to be vapor filters that are specifically designed for paint. And I'll put links to all of this in the video description. You're going to need some good gloves, and I really like these DNA gloves because they're a bit higher quality. They don't break very easily. You should use some glasses, and you can use a full face mask, which is probably a good idea because if you get solvent splashing up in your face, it really hurts. And I've actually had solvent in my eye. When I was washing out, it splashed up, and yeah, it really hurt. It can actually send you blind. I don't usually wear these coveralls because it's usually way too hot here and they just get in the way, but probably a good idea. You need some metho and a good microfiber cloth. Measuring container, very important with all the measurements written on it for measuring out your portions for paint. I just use this aluminium rod for mixing. So all of this equipment you can get from any paint store. You're going to need sandpaper. I always use wet and dry. I really should recommend everything through from 400 to 2500 grit. But for repainting cases, I only ever use 600 grit. You're also going to need some sanding blocks, and Scotch-Brite is also good if you're going to be painting plastics and mesh. Let's move on to paints. This is where it gets really complex because there are so many different paint products. But the first thing you need to think about is what type of paint are you going to use? Enamel, acrylic, 2-pack? Well, I like to use 2-pack. I started with acrylic, but with acrylic you are not going to get as good a finish as you are going to get with 2-pack. Nowhere near it. when I'm talking about a high gloss finish. It's just very difficult with acrylic. And also acrylic is nowhere near as hard and durable. So I absolutely love 2-pack paints and I highly recommend them. And when it comes to paint brands, different paint stores are going to be committed to selling different brands, and they're just going to push whatever brand they're selling, which, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the best one. So just keep that in mind. You should really figure out your paint brands not based on what they recommend, but more based on, all paints are going to be pretty much the same. Unless you buy really cheap, horrible paint, you should go for something kind of mid-range. This here is mid-range paint, DuPont 600. This here is extremely high-end paint. It's very expensive. It's double the price of kind of the nearest thing to it. But you do notice the difference. It is worth it when you're getting into special effects and really high-end paint jobs. But, if you're just painting your case, let's say we're just painting this case white and that's it, well, then it doesn't really matter. And you could just use spray cans for a job like that. What we're looking at here is extremely high gloss finishes, special effects, and you can see what I have here is a white base coat and then a white pearl. So we're actually going to be painting this case in a white pearl. And I'll get to what case it is shortly when we start to strip it down. Okay, so primer. This is a 2-pack primer. Obviously that's going to go down first. So 2-pack means there's a hardener and a thinner. And you can see that on the hardener and the thinner or reducer, it says medium and slow. That's how fast the paint goes off. And there's actually slow, medium, and fast for these DNA products. And you can actually experiment with that. With the primer, it doesn't really matter. It depends on your climate, the temperature. If it's 15 degrees and really dry, well, then it's going to really be different compared to what it is here right now, which is 30 degrees and 85% humidity. And again, trial and error, you're just going to need to play around with that. I suggest going for medium to start with, and then really, as I said, for primer, it's not so critical. When it comes to the clear, it is very important, because if you have, if it goes off quickly, if you have a fast hardener, well, then it doesn't get a chance to flow and to get a really nice flat glassy finish. Whereas if you have slow and it has a bit of time to flow, you get a beautiful finish, but then you have much higher risk of runs. So, you have to be very careful of that. Okay, so after the primer, we have the DuPont 600 white undercoat and white pearl. The reason I'm not using DNA for this is because DNA doesn't have a huge range, and I'll use DNA as much as I can, but every now and then when I want a specific effect or color that DNA doesn't have, I have to go outside of their range. So with the base coat, you also need a thinner, which I have here, or reducer. And then finally the clear coat. Again, it's 2-pack. And so that's what we're going to be using today. But, if you're using just flat colors, then it's just a primer, base coat, clear coat. Or if you're using, candy dyes and doing all kinds of special effects, which I often do, well, then it might be a primer, base coat, candy, clear coat, and then, even a flake. There's just so much you can do and so much to learn about. But that's what I love with paint, all of the different special effects and cool things you can do with it. It's a lot of fun. The case that I'm going to be painting today is the CoolerMaster MasterCase 5 Pro. I've stripped down the case as far as I can without drilling out any rivets. Now, a case that is advertised as the modder's case, which the CoolerMaster MasterCase 5 Pro really is, ideally shouldn't have any rivets. But it's really good that we could actually strip it down this far without having to drill any rivets, because a lot of cases have the 5.25-inch bays, 3.5-inch bays riveted into position, and it just makes it a lot more difficult if you want to modify the case. So I can certainly appreciate that you can strip down the case this far. I mean, even the handle off the top, the case feet, it's pretty good, that is for sure. And looking at a lot of these other components, they're also very easy to dismantle. For example, it's going to be easy to remove the mesh from this top panel, simple to remove it from the front panel, easy to remove the side panel window. So, I do think this is a good modding case, that's for sure. Now, luckily, this is going to be a two-tone paint job, so that is going to allow it to be a little bit easier when it comes to painting, because we can kind of choose parts strategically not to paint that either would be very difficult to paint or are going to have a negative effect on the case. But also, obviously, we need to choose them so that there is a balance between the two colors. But for this case, the black is going to be more of an accent. There's going to be a lot more white. But what I'm thinking so far, I mean, there's some things you just can't paint. Obviously, you can't paint these, the rubber. I would definitely prefer not to attempt painting these because they're a flexible plastic. So that's just going to create a weak surface for the paint and is going to certainly create problems once you start installing drives. It's going to just tear the paint off. And kind of the same thing for these. I mean, I wouldn't have a problem with painting all of these drive bays. I can disassemble them and paint them in parts and get a really good coverage. And I mean, you can actually paint them assembled like this. Obviously, you just spray in from the side here, spray in from that side. It's a bit more difficult, but if you can disassemble them, you always should, because you are going to get better coverage and a better surface. But I'm going to avoid painting the drive bays, because when you slide drives in, the tolerances are so small. There's probably less than 1 mil on either side. And once I paint it, that mill is taken up. So then you try to push a drive in, it's going to be a lot tighter. So you really need to think about this with custom paint. And that's why a lot of professional painters, really fail when it comes to computers, because they just don't understand computers. You need to know how this is going to go together, what components are going to be installed and where. Because what I would do if I had to paint this is fully disassemble it and sandblast or sand the paint completely off right down to the surface, and then put the bare minimum of coverage on the insides of these where the drives go, so that you don't end up with that problem. But you need to think about that everywhere. I've chosen the parts of the case that I'm going to paint because, as I've mentioned, this is going to be a two-tone paint job. So I'm going to paint the internal steel panels of the case, the main chassis, also both of the side panels, the case feet, the handles at the top, the front I/O section, minus the section that fits around the connectivity and buttons, because that section actually has some transparent parts to it for the LEDs to shine through. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't actually paint it. I could mask those sections off and easily paint that part if I wanted to. And that also goes for any case. As I've mentioned, some parts are going to be quite difficult to paint, and it is going to require a lot more preparation. But that doesn't mean that you can't do it. You know, you can really paint about 99% of any case. The only parts that you can't paint are any really soft, flexible materials. For example, soft plastics and rubber. You should certainly avoid painting. I'm also going to paint this cover here that fits over the front top handle, the top panel and front panel minus the mesh. Now you can see removing the mesh on the front panel also removes the reinforcing structure, whereas on the top the reinforcing structure is left behind. It's part of the top panel. So I'm going to have to mask this off so that the front and top panel will match. Otherwise, obviously, the reinforcing structure is going to be white on this one and then black on this one. I've completely stripped down the case and I can now start on surface preparation. Now, you don't actually have to strip down the case completely like this. This is a lot of extra work, but it is definitely worth doing because overall you are going to get better coverage and a better finish. I mean, if it's a massive case and you have plenty of room to get the gun in, well, then maybe, you can get it and you can get a good enough finish and good enough coverage. But this way, it's just more consistent, the painting is going to be easier, and you can definitely get a better quality paint job. Now, there is one panel that I'm not going to remove. I'm going to leave it riveted, and it's this rear I/O panel. It's not much to actually remove that, but it really doesn't need to be removed. I can easily get good coverage and good finish. I can get in around this quite nicely. Although I wouldn't mind being able to get in there on a bit of a better angle, but I find it's better to leave this panel in position because, again, the thickness of the paint, which I've already mentioned briefly, is something that really has an effect on this panel. If there's even the slightest discrepancy in the measurements for the rear I/O, you have trouble fitting in the motherboard and the graphics cards are kind of bolted in crooked. You really need to be careful of that with this panel. So you're better off leaving this one, anything to do with the rear I/O, pretty much, bolted into position so that we don't end up getting those discrepancies from the thickness of the paint. These panels here, just reinforcing panels for the corners. I'm not going to paint those because they're not visible anyway, and this is a two-tone paint job. And the power supply mounting rails, I'm not going to paint either. There is no doubt that surface preparation is the most important part of custom paint. And really it's where most of the time and effort goes. Just like anything, if you lay down good groundwork, then you're going to achieve, or you're going to have a better chance of achieving a good result. But if you don't lay down the good groundwork, you have no chance of achieving a good result. Doesn't matter how good a painter you are, how good your gun is, how good the paint is, the result is going to, reflect the job that you did on the surface preparation. Any problems with the surface, you're going to see later, and a lot of them are going to be magnified. So you really need to put in the time and effort and get your surface preparation perfect, because there's so much that can go wrong. I mean, it's not just, scratches, pit marks, whatever. It's also fry-ups where the paint doesn't stick. there are lots of problems that you can have. And even if you're not a good painter and you've never sprayed before, painting is pretty straightforward and common sense. So if you get the surface preparation right, as long as you get even coverage, you don't lay too much on, you have the gun set up pretty well, you know, where it's not too dry, not too wet, well, you have a very good chance of achieving a beautiful paint job. So this is why I've spent up to 20 hours on surface preparation for a single case. On the big Case Labs cases, if you want a really high gloss finish, then surface preparation becomes even more important. For example, this panel has a pretty good surface already. It's smooth, you know, it's a beautiful finish. I could just paint straight over this and without a problem, but there's another reason to sand, so that the paint takes better. Obviously, the little lines and scratches in the surface are going to help the paint to bite into the surface. So it just creates a stronger, higher quality paint job, but also because the customer wants a high gloss finish on this case. I'm not sure if the camera is going to pick it up, but this is actually a satin finish and it's a little bit textured. And this is going to be magnified as I lay more layers of paint on, and this later will turn into a kind of dry looking orange peel. You know, it won't be good. So it needs to be taken down flat. Now I am actually using 800 grit for this, so you probably want to get yourself some 800 as well. I'm going to use 600 on the metal parts, 800 on the plastic. And I'm just purely going by feel. It's something I've done enough times where I don't really think about it. I just go by feel because I've learned completely by trial and error. So I'm going to continue sanding for probably the next 4 hours or so. And I'm going to leave this part of this video here. In the second part, we'll do the actual painting. So that sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Remember that none of this would be possible without our patrons.